Hi everyone, welcome to CIT 171. This is the video lecture over Chapter 3, Table Creation and Management. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about actually how we create tables, how we manage those tables. So to get started, before you begin this lecture, make sure that you have completed all of the work for the previous chapter in Chapter 2. In that chapter, we set up our Scott user, we set up our Just Lead Books database, and you're going to need both of those things set up before you can complete the homework for this chapter. So make sure that you've got your Just Lead Books um, database set up. And if you need to know how to do that, go back and watch the video lecture from the previous chapter where I discuss how we run the Just Lead Books build script to actually build the tables in our database. So just to get started on this chapter on table creation, in the previous chapter, after we set up our database, we just ran some basic SQL select statements to query our database and select and view some of the data that was created in the tables. In this chapter, we're going to be getting into how we actually create those tables. And then in chapter 4, we're also going to be talking about how we build relationships between those tables and how we set up constraints on those tables so that the data is structured in a way that we see fit. So whenever you're looking at commands in SQL that are on Oracle that are to create or modify the database tables or the database structure, those commands are called data definition language commands, or DDL. In subsequent chapters, we're going to be talking more about data manipulation language, or DML, which is more about how we, now that we have the tables, how we insert data into those tables, how we update data within those tables. So this chapter is really focused just on DDL, or data definition language, where we're actually creating the tables, modifying or altering the tables, and dropping the tables. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the details on everything that's within this chapter. Make sure that you go and you actually read through the chapter because it has a lot of very important details on things like the table design. Oracle has specific rules about naming conventions on tables, how many a limit on the number of characters that could be in a table name or in a column name. So make sure you read through the chapter and get all of those details. In this video, what I really want to show you is more of a hands-on, here's how we create those tables and run some of these DDL commands in Oracle and SQL Plus so that you get a better idea of how to do that. You can follow along on your own version of Oracle if you want, and this will hopefully get you to a place where you can more easily complete the homework assignment that you have this week for this chapter. So with that, I think let's go ahead and get into creating some tables. So before we create a table, there's a few things that we do need to make sure we know. We have to figure out what we want to name the table. We also have to figure out what columns we want in the table and what we want to name those columns. And then we're also going to have to figure out what data type we're going to give to those columns. Is it a varchar? Does it contain letters, numbers, symbols? Or is it going to be a number data type because it's only going to have numeric values in it? Or it could be a date. It could be a date type where that field is only going to store date values. So we have to do a little bit of pre-planning and figure out what we want to name that table, how we want to structure that table, and what columns we want to be in that table. So as an example, for our Just Lead Books database, let's pretend that we want to create a new table. Let's say we have some multiple locations for our bookstore, and we want to have a table that stores the information about those stores in it. So we could create a table called store. So before we get started on that, let's go ahead and make sure you fire up SQL Plus and log in to your database, and let's log in as the Scott user. So that we created, again, we created this in the last chapter. So if you haven't done that, make sure you go back and get the Scott user created and set up your Just Lead Books database. So I'm going to enter Scott as my username, and then the password was Tiger, Tiger, all lowercase. That's what we set up in the last chapter. And you can see that we've logged in now to our Oracle database, and we're ready to go ahead and get started and enter SQL commands. So before we do that and do the create the table, let's go ahead and run a command, select table underscore names from, I think it's actually name, from user underscore tables. When we run that command, it's going to give us a list of all of the tables that were created whenever we ran our Just Lead Books build database script. So we have an orders table, a customers table, a publisher table, an authors table, and so on and so forth. So what we want to do is we're going to create a new table that's going to be added to this list, and we're going to call it store. And that, again, that table is going to contain information about the stores, the different locations we have for our Just Lead Books business. So let's go ahead and run a create table statement. So to create the table, the first thing you have to do is enter the command create table. And after you do create table, you have to enter the name of the table. Since all of our other tables in this database are all in all capital letters, I'm going to stick with that naming convention, although you don't have to have capital letters in all of your table names. So I'm going to call it store, and then I'm going to hit enter. And if you remember from the previous chapter, the previous lecture, when you hit enter, if you don't put a semicolon, SQL Plus is going to go to the second line. So this number 2 here represents the second line of our SQL command. So after I've put in the name of my table, I'm going to put a parenthesis, and now I'm going to start listing out the columns that I want in my table and their data type. So let's say the first column that I want to create in my table called store is called store num. So each store that we have is going to have a unique store number, and this is also going to be our primary key. So store num is the store number, and or is the column name for the store number, and we need to give it a data type. So you do space, and then you want to choose the data type. So for store num, I'm planning on this table only having numeric values for the store number. We're not going to have any alpha characters. We're not going to have any symbols. So I'm going to give this a data type of number. And I think that our store numbers for Just Lead Books are going to be 5 digits long. So I'm going to put in the number 5 in the data type. So now I have the data type is number, and the length of that field or that column is going to be 5. I'm going to put a comma to separate out my column names. Now I can start to list another column here, but I'm going to go ahead down to the third line just to make the command look a little bit, I guess, cleaner. Let's go ahead and do the next column, which I'm going to call store name. So this is the name of our store. Maybe we have a Lexington location. Maybe we have a location in Elizabethtown. We can put the store name in this field. It doesn't have to be the city, by the way. It could be, you could call it whatever you want it to. The Hamburg, the Hamburg store name. So let's go ahead. Now the store name is obviously going to have alpha characters in it. So we're going to do a varchar, varchar 2. Now in your book, it's going to give a description of each one of these data types. So again, make sure you read through the chapter because it will give you a lot more information than I'm going to go into here in this video around what each of these data types actually means and what the rules are around it, what they're meant for. But a varchar 2, let's say I'm going to say our store names are always going to be 20 characters or less. I'm going to make another column called city. And let's say the city is going to be a varchar 2, And the city, let's say it's also going to be 20 characters, and that's where our store is located. And then the last field I'm going to add here is a state code. And I want my state code, I want to differentiate because I want it to actually be the abbreviated version of the state, not the full state name. So I'm going to do state code. And since it's the abbreviated version, I want to make sure that I only have um, 2 characters. It cannot be more than 2 characters long. So now that I've listed all of my columns here, I need to make sure I do a close parenthesis to close out the list of column names. And then I'm going to make sure I'm going to put a semicolon because the semicolon is going to tell SQL Plus, hey, you have completed this command, and whenever I press enter, it's actually going to execute the command. So I hit enter, and now I see it, my table has been created. So if I go and I run my select table name from user tables again, now I see in the list that I have my store table is there. We can also do a describe command, DESC, on my store table. And you can see here, it has the table that I just created and all of the columns, store num, store name, city, state code, and its data types, number, varchar2, and their lengths. Okay, so that is the basics of how you create a simple table in Oracle using the create table command. Now, you notice if I do a select all from store, no rows were selected. Why is that? Because there's no data that's actually in our store table yet. And again, in chapter, I believe 5, we're going to start looking at data manipulation and how we can actually insert data into that table. But there's actually another cool trick with SQL and Oracle to go ahead and populate some data within that table. And that's because that's by when you do a create table command, you can create it as a select statement. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say we have a customer table. If I do select all from customer, customers. When I select all from customers, you see I have a list of customers here. The customer number, the last name, the first name, their city, their state, their zip, the referred field, and there's also a region field that's cut off here right at the very end. I could do a describe on it, but you could probably see it a little bit better. Let's do describe customers. There we go. Customer number, last name, first name, address, city, state, referred, and region. So let's say I want to create a table based upon the data that is in here. But maybe I don't want every field, I just want some of the fields. So what I can do here is I can do a create table, just as I did before. Create table. I'm going to call this table customer market. And I believe this is an example that's in your book. So I'm going to create a table, customer market, and then I'm going to say it's created as, and then a parenthesis. Now instead of listing the columns that I want, I'm going to do a select. So now I'm going to select certain fields from this table. Let's say I want customer number, the city, the state, the zip, referred, and region from customers. Close my parenthesis for my select statement and do my semicolon to end the command. Now, when I hit enter, it's created another table. I can describe the table, customer market, and there you see it has the exact fields that I selected from the customers table: customer number, city, state, zip, referred, and region. Now, when I actually look in this table, you will see that it actually selected the data from the customers table and inserted it into this new table when it created it. The customer number, city, state, zip, referred, and region. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so that's how you can quickly create a table using a select statement and actually also populate it with data at the same time. Now, what if I wanted to do that same thing, but I didn't want to name it customer number? I didn't want to have a column called customer number. Let's say I wanted to change the column and make it a different name. Let me show you how you do that. We're going to do create table, but this time we also have to name it. Let's call it cust market 2 as our second table. Now, you notice when I've done my create table in the past, whenever I did the create table for the customer market table, I didn't actually list um, any field names outside of my select statement. But what I can do here is I can do a parenthesis and I can actually type the names of the fields as I actually want them to be. State, zip, referred, region. So now notice that I changed customer number with a hash to customer underscore ID. So I want, in this table, I want it to be called customer ID and not customer number or customer pound sign as it is in the customers table. So I'm going to say as, and then do my select statement again. Select customer number, city, state, zip, referred, and region from, let's do a big line, from customers, and there we go. Now, when I run this, I've created another table, and I'm going to describe that table. And as you can see, now the first field is called customer underscore ID as opposed to customer number as it was on the other table. So I was able to define the table names that I wanted, and I could have done that on any table. I could have called it any other name I wanted it to be. And it would have selected these. So customer number will get selected into customer ID. City gets selected into whatever I named this second column or this second field here. I could have named this any name I wanted to name it other than city, and it would have inserted data into that and named it as that new name. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So two different ways we can create tables. We can just do a basic create table. We can also do create table from select, and then we can, or as select. We can also do a create table as select, and we can define our field names if we want. So feel free to play around with that yourself if you want to do some more examples, but hopefully that will get you the basic gist of how to do those. Now, we've created our table. Let's talk more about how we can actually alter or modify that table. So the basic command for altering the table is simply that, alter table. So let's go ahead and type alter table. And let's alter our store table that we created previously. So I'm going to type in my name of my table, store. I'm going to do a new line. And let's say I want to add a column. So let's say in our store table, we had the city, we had the state. Let's say we also want to add a zip code. So I want to add a column, and I'm going to say zip code. I have to give it a data type. I'm going to call varchar2, and let's say a zip code 40509. That's 5 characters long, digits long. Let's close our parenthesis, and we can add a zip code table that is 5 characters long. Table is altered when I do describe on store. Now you can see that I have the zip code field has been added. So that's the way you can modify that table. Now, one problem with zip code is that a lot of times zip codes are stored with, they have a specific area of the zip code. So you may have 40509-1234 or something like that. So let's say we realize, oh, that's a flaw in our database. We want to actually be able to store those extra digits for the zip code. And we want to change this, instead of it being a 5, we want to change it to be a 15, just to make sure we have enough room for all those characters. So to do that, we can actually modify an existing column. So I want to do alter table again, enter the name of the table that I want to alter. This time, instead of add, I'm going to use the command modify. So when I modify, I'm going to specify the column that I want to modify, which is zip code, and I'm going to just simply set the data type now to be varchar15 instead. End it with my semicolon. Table is altered. If I do describe store, you can see now instead of varchar 5, it's varchar 15. So now I've expanded or modified the column in my table. So two different ways you can alter a table here. Alter table, add a column. Alter table, modify a column. Now, of course, we can also drop a column. We can add, modify, and then drop. So let's say I want to drop the zip code table, the zip code column that I just created. So you probably already guessed, we're going to alter table store. Instead of add or modify, we're going to do a drop. So we're going to drop column, and we're going to specify the column we want to drop, which is zip code. And now the table is altered again. I can do describe store, and the zip code column is now has been deleted or has been removed. Let's say I decide that I don't want to call this table store. Let's say I want to rename it to something else. There's also a rename command, and it's just rename. And now let's say I want to call, instead of it store, I want to call it store info. So I tell it rename store to store info. Run it. Table has been renamed. And now if I try to describe store, object store does not exist because we renamed it. So now let's describe store info. And now our table has been renamed to store info. Okay, so just a quick review. We've created a table. We've created a table as a select statement to where we actually selected data from another table into our new table. We have altered our table. By adding a column, we altered our table to modify a column. We altered our table then to drop a column. And finally, we've renamed a table to a new name. So let's talk about another way to alter your table, and that's to alter a table and set a column as being unused. So when you set a column as being unused, it doesn't actually drop the column or remove it, but it does mark it for deletion, essentially. So you no longer see it if you select data from that table. You no longer see the data that's in that table. You also, whenever you do a describe, you're not going to see that column listed anymore. It's still there, but you can change it back to being used again if you want to. So it's basically just a way, you can think of it as hiding a column from anyone to be able to use. And it's essentially marking it for deletion, because then you can go through and drop any unused columns, any columns that are marked as unused. So let me show you how to do that really quickly. Alter table. Let's alter our customer market table. So if you remember, if I describe our customer market table, we have customer number, city, state, zip, referred, and region. So let's say we don't want to see that the state field, state column anymore. I'm going to do alter table, customer market, and I'm going to say set unused, and then in parentheses I put the column that I want to set as unused, and I'm going to do state. Okay. Table's been altered. If I describe customer market again, you see the state is no longer listed. If I select everything select all from customer market, I no longer see state listed here as well. So That is how you mark a table as unused, and um, essentially, again, it just hides the table so that so that you can't see it. And then you can do a drop unused columns, and that's going to drop drop the columns that are marked as unused. Okay, so from there, let's talk about what if we want to delete data out of our table. We're going to talk about, when we talk about DML commands, data manipulation language, we're going to talk about the delete command, where you can delete a specific row. But sometimes you may have a table and you just need to delete every record that's in that table, every row. And there is a command that is very handy that will just delete up everything and can free up space in your database. And it's called truncate table. So let's say we have, or we still have our table customer market 2. It has 20 rows in it. If we want to delete all 20 rows at one time, we can run truncate table cust market 2, and the table is truncated. Now if we select all from cust market 2, no rows selected. So everything has now been deleted from the customer market 2 table. Okay, so now we've learned how to delete all the data from a table. How do we actually delete a table from our database? How do we delete customer market or customer market 2, for example? Well, it's called drop table. So we do a drop table command, and then we just simply specify the table we want to drop. In our case, let's just do customer market. We don't want to see that one anymore. And let's run it. So the table is now dropped. So if I try to do a describe on customer market now, it's no longer there. It does not exist anymore. But is it actually deleted completely from storage? Is it completely deleted from our database? It's actually not. In the newer versions of Oracle, I think it was after 10. So Oracle 11G, 12C, 18C, all of those, the new versions, I believe, have this. But you can do a select. It basically moves the data, moves the table to a recycle bin. So we can select object name and original name from recycle bin. As you can see, there's lots of tables in here that I've actually deleted that are sitting here in the recycle bin. But here at the very bottom, you'll see the object name, which is this, and then the original name, which was customer market. So there's the table that we just dropped, customer market. Now, there's actually a way you can bring this table back. It's called flashback. Flashback the table. Flashback table. Now, we tell the table we want to bring back, customer market, and we want to do it before it was dropped. So do 2 before drop. The flashback is complete. And now if I describe customer market, it's back. I can select data from it again, and the data is all back. Okay, so that's how you delete it. Now, what if I want to just delete this table and also completely remove it from the recycle bin, emptying the recycle bin, for example? When you drop the table, you can also issue, you can use the purge flag, which will actually purge it from the database entirely. So to do that, we do a drop table again, customer market, and this time we do purge at the end. So let's run that. Now the table is dropped, and if I select object name and original name from the recycle bin, you can see customer market is not there at all anymore. It's no longer even in the recycle bin at all. So it's completely gone, and there's only 19 rows this time. So it's completely gone from our database, and there's no way if we do flashback table customer market to before drop, the object is not in the recycle bin. So when you use the purge command, that is going to completely wipe it out from your database where it is not recoverable at all. Okay, so just a quick review because I think that's pretty much the end of the chapter. And that's all of the commands that I think we cover in this chapter. So just to review, we talked about creating a table, listing the columns that we want to create and their data types. We talked about creating a table using a select statement so we can actually populate the table with data from another table. We talked about altering the table so we can add columns, modify columns, drop columns. We also talked about how to rename a table. We talked about how we can alter a table and set a column name to be unused, which is essentially marking it for deletion and hides it where it can no longer be queried. And then we talked about truncating a table. So when we want to delete all of the records from a table, we can truncate it. And then we talked about dropping a table and then how to view the table we dropped in the recycle bin, recover it or do a flashback to bring it back, and how we can actually delete, drop it and do a purge to where it's gone from the database entirely. Okay, so I know that's probably a lot in a short amount of time. Again, please read through your chapter to make sure you get a full and deeper understanding. This lecture was just to do a walkthrough where you could walk through with me on how to run some of these commands on your Oracle database in SQL+. Your book is going to show you examples, but it's going to be using SQL Developer, which we're going to use later on in the course. But this way you can see how it's done and how it looks in SQL+. And you should be able to, use this to help you complete your homework at the end of this chapter. So as always, please email me if you have any questions. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.